Welcome to another deep dive.
Yay.
Today we're taking a look at Pima Chodron, and specifically her book, When Things Fall Apart.
Yeah. A really insightful look at dealing with, well, when things fall apart.
Exactly. We were given quite a few writings, actually. Not just the book itself, but talks she's given over the years, all from like 1987 to 1994.
It's interesting to see how consistent her message is over the years.
Right. So in these writings, we see this recurring theme of loving kindness,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Tree?
matry,
Yeah.
and also this fearless compassion
Hmm.
for ourselves and for others.
Absolutely. And it all sort of stems from this idea of relaxing with the groundlessness.
Right, relaxing into the fact that there's no solid ground.
Yeah. And learning to see past all these dualities that we create.
Right, the us versus them, the good versus bad, all
Yeah,
that stuff.
Exactly. It's all very much interconnected.
So today, we're going to try to get to the heart of it all. Like, what is Pema Chodron really saying about how to be with ourselves?
Yeah.
How to be with the world when things are tough?
I think that's a great way to frame it, looking at those moments when things feel like they're unraveling and how to find our footing.
Exactly. And we want to do this in a way that's clear and practical. Not getting bogged down in philosophical jargon, but something you can actually take away and apply in your own life.
Actionable insights.
Yes, exactly. So let's start with something that might seem a bit counterintuitive at first. This idea of intimacy with fear.
Fear, right. I mean, we're often told to avoid it, right? Suppress it, run from it.
Yeah, fight it, ignore it, do anything but actually feel it.
But what Chaldron is saying is actually fear can be a sign that we're getting closer to something real, something true.
It's almost like a compass pointing us in the right direction.
Exactly. She even mentions her Zen teacher, Kobun Shinoroshi, who had this simple but powerful response to everything.
I agree.
I agree.
Yeah, it's about acknowledging whatever arises, including fear, without judgment.
So instead of immediately trying to push it away, we actually turn towards it. And this is where things get really interesting because Chodron argues that when we habitually try to escape from fear, we actually cut ourselves off from the richness of the present moment.
We become so focused on avoiding discomfort that we miss out on the fullness of what's actually happening.
Precisely. And she doesn't just talk about this theoretically, she shares her own powerful personal experience at Gampo Abbey.
Oh, right. She talks about how she had this carefully crafted image of herself as this, capable, adaptable golden girl.
Yeah. But when she arrived at the Abbey, everything started to fall apart.
All those strategies for control and manipulation that she'd relied on just stopped working.
And all her unresolved issues, her insecurities, her fears, everything she'd been trying to avoid, it all came to the surface.
And not just to the surface. She was surrounded by a community, so it was all very public.
Exactly. And it was incredibly painful, incredibly humbling.
But also incredibly transformative.
Yes. She describes it as this crucial testing ground for genuine spiritual growth. It forced her to confront herself in a very raw and honest way.
And sometimes, as she points out, it's not through deliberate choice that we find ourselves in these situations where everything falls apart. Sometimes it's through events like illness or the loss of a loved one.
Right. She tells this really poignant story about a friend of hers who was dying of AIDS.
Oh, right. At first, he was filled with so much terror and resentment.
Yeah, it was incredibly difficult for him to accept.
But eventually, he came to see his illness as this incredible gift.
A gift. How can something so painful be a gift?
Well, because it stripped away all the superficiality, all the distractions, and it made every single moment, every interaction incredibly precious.
Wow.
It's almost like he developed this heightened awareness, this appreciation for the fragility and beauty of life, precisely because he was facing death so directly.
I see. So instead of recoiling from these difficult experiences, maybe we can learn to approach them with a sense of curiosity, a willingness to see what unexpected gifts they might hold.
Exactly. We tend to view those moments when things fall apart as the end of the story, the final chapter. But Chodron offers this alternative perspective. Maybe it's not the end, but actually the beginning of something new, something we couldn't have possibly predicted.
The start of a new adventure, even.
Right. She shares this beautiful story about a crippled son who, because of his physical limitations, wasn't drafted into the war. And while all the other able-bodied men were taken away, he stayed behind and ultimately saved his family.
It's amazing how what we initially perceive as misfortune can actually turn out to be a blessing in disguise.
Absolutely. And this brings us to a fundamental Buddhist concept, samsara.
Ah, yes. That endless cycle of chasing after pleasure and desperately trying to avoid pain.
Right, and the Buddha's first noble truth speaks directly to this. Suffering, he says, is an inherent part of our experience. As long as we cling to the illusion of permanence, as long as we believe that external things can give us lasting security.
So, from this perspective, it's only when our comfortable assumptions are shattered, when we find ourselves on shaky ground, that we truly confront reality.
Precisely. It's in that very moment of groundlessness, when we have nothing to hold on to, that we face a crucial choice.
Do we awaken to what is, or do we try to numb ourselves and retreat back into our familiar patterns?
Exactly. And Kudrin sees this groundlessness, this lack of solid ground, as the fertile ground for both our capacity for compassion and the recognition of our own inherent goodness.
That's really interesting. It's like the ground has to be broken open for something new to emerge.
And she shares a very personal story that illustrates this beautifully. She talks about the moment she found out about her husband's affair.
Oh, wow. That must have been devastating.
It was. She describes this initial shock, this almost surreal stillness amidst all the emotional turmoil, followed by this raw, very human impulse to react with aggression, with anger.
It's like the ground of her reality had been completely shattered.
Yes. And in that moment, she had a choice to either contribute to the cycle of aggression and pain or to consciously choose to practice peace, starting with herself.
And she connects this very personal experience to the choices we all face every day.
Right. We live in a world that's saturated with conflict and aggression. But in each moment, even in the midst of our own personal crises, we have this fundamental choice to either perpetuate that cycle of negativity or to consciously choose a different path.
That path, peace.
Exactly. And this leads us naturally to another key idea she explores. The profound wisdom inherent in the phrase, "this very moment is the perfect teacher."
Ah, yes. The present moment as our greatest teacher.
She beautifully articulates how the practice of meditation can help us to recognize our limits, to see those points where we tend to contract or shut down without getting completely swept away by hope and fear.
Okay, I'm curious to hear more about this. How does meditation help us to recognize our limits?
Well, through consistent practice, you begin to develop this heightened awareness of your own thoughts and emotions as they arise. You learn to observe them with a degree of detachment, without immediately reacting or getting entangled in their narrative.
Well, it's not about trying to get rid of thoughts or emotions, but rather about learning to see them more clearly.
Exactly. And even in those inevitable moments when you do find yourself shutting down, when you feel yourself contracting emotionally, meditation brings this new level of awareness to that very act of closing off.
So instead of just unconsciously shutting down, you begin to observe the process as it happens.
Precisely. And she points out that experiences like disappointment and embarrassment, those moments when our carefully constructed sense of self feels like it's crumbling, are actually a form of death of our familiar ground.
Our sense of competence, our control, it all just disappears.
Right. And instead of fighting that fear of this metaphorical death, she encourages us to reframe it, to see it as a necessary prelude to something new emerging, to a potential rebirth.
It's like the old has to die to make way for the new.
Exactly. So reaching our limit from this perspective isn't a punishment, but actually a sign of health, a message that it's time to pause the struggle and look directly at whatever's making us feel threatened.
So when we feel that fear and trembling, that anxiety and discomfort, it's actually a good sign.
In a way, yes, it's a sign that we're on the verge of venturing into uncharted territory,
Yeah.
that we're ready to let go of our old ways of being and embrace something new.
And what might we discover in that uncharted territory?
Often, it's the unexpected realization of egolessness.
Egolessness.
Yes, those moments when all our carefully crafted plans and strategies for maintaining control simply unravel, that's when we often catch a glimpse of the emptiness of self, of the inherent groundlessness of our existence.
That can be a very disorienting experience.
It can, but it can also be incredibly liberating. It can free us from the tyranny of our own ego, from that constant need to be in control, to be right, to be perfect.
And where does meditation fit into all of this?
Kodron suggests that the most supportive environment to begin exploring this, to start to develop this capacity for recognizing our limits and embracing egolessness, is through formal meditation practice.
Okay.
On the cushion, you have the opportunity to practice not indulging every fleeting desire or repressing every passing discomfort.
So it's about finding that middle ground, that balance between the extremes.
Exactly. You start to develop a felt sense of what it's like to simply allow the energy of your thoughts and emotions to be present without getting carried away. And that consistent daily practice becomes incredibly valuable because it's like planting seeds that gradually allow you to be more awake and more fully present in the midst of the inherent chaos of daily life.
So the aim isn't to become a perfect meditator, but rather to become more fully awake and engaged in our lives.
Precisely. And the way we learn to navigate between those extremes of indulgence and repression in meditation is by simply acknowledging whatever arises, whether it's a thought, a feeling, or a physical sensation, without judgment. We allow it to unfold, to eventually dissolve, and then we gently redirect our attention back to the open awareness of the present moment.
And over time, this dedicated practice on the cushion starts to shape how we relate to the inevitable ebb and flow of hope and fear in our daily lives.
Absolutely. We might find that almost effortlessly, we start to release that internal battle and simply relax into the present moment.
We disengage from that constant inner commentary and reconnect with a fresh, unbiased awareness of what's actually happening.
And it's interesting how she then observes that as we become more accustomed to this openness, we might start to assume that it will take increasingly dramatic events to really shake us, to really wake us up. But then she points out that often the opposite can be true. The big dramatic events, those can definitely be powerful catalysts for awakening. But often it's the smaller, seemingly insignificant things that can still catch us off guard.
The little things that trigger our habitual patterns and reactions.
Exactly. And regardless of the scale of the discomfort, the fundamental principle remains the same. To lean into it, to observe it with clarity and curiosity, rather than instinctively trying to shield ourselves.
So it always comes back to that simple but profound instruction. This very moment is the perfect teacher.
Right. True awakening, true understanding, it's not some external achievement. It's not something we have to attain in some distant future. It's right here, readily available in every single moment of our lived experience.
In our joy, in our pain, in our confusion, and our clarity.
Exactly. And the key is simply learning to be present with it all without the filter of dissociation.
Simply observing what's unfolding without judgment.
Okay, so now let's move on to this concept of relax as it is. Once we have this basic understanding that the present moment is our greatest teacher, how do we actually apply that in our daily lives?
It really comes down to a willingness to lighten up, to loosen our grip on how we think things should be.
And to be honest with ourselves just as we are in this moment.
Exactly. Chodron introduces the Shamatha Vipassana meditation instruction, as taught by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, as a central method for cultivating this relaxed awareness.
I see. And initially the instruction was simply to open the mind and relax. If thoughts came up, you just gently let them dissolve and return to that open state.
That was the essence of it. But Rinpoche noticed that many students found even that simple instruction to be really challenging. They needed something a bit more concrete, something to help them find that state of relaxed openness.
So he started introducing some refinements to the technique.
Yes. While the underlying intention remained the same, he began to emphasize the importance of posture as a foundation for practice.
Yeah.
And then he guided students to gently place their awareness on the out-breath.
So the out-breath became this subtle anchor for the mind.
Exactly. He described it as being the closest physical sensation you could get to simply resting the mind in its naturally open state, while still providing a focal point for the attention to return to when it inevitably wandered.
That makes sense. And he even shifted the language away from the idea of forceful concentration to something much more fluid and gentle.
Right. Phrases like, touch the out-breath and let it go, or maintain a light and gentle attention. The key is to open and relax without adding layers of conceptualization.
Just to be present with the mind as it is, inherently clear and open.
Exactly. And then there was the further refinement of labeling thoughts as thinking.
Thinking.
Yes. So as you're sitting there with this gentle awareness on the out-breath, it's natural for your mind to wander off into planning, worrying, reminiscing. The moment you become aware that your attention has drifted, you simply and gently say to yourself, thinking, and then, without any judgment or making a big deal out of it, you softly redirect your attention back to the sensation of the out-breath.
I see. So it's about acknowledging the thought without getting swept away by its content.
Precisely. And she emphasizes that this isn't about trying to suppress negative thoughts or cling to positive ones. It's about being open to whatever arises in the present moment, without any agenda.
And she quotes Allen Ginsberg, who talks about surprise arises.
Yes. Whether that surprise is pleasant or unpleasant, the instruction is the same. Acknowledge it, label it thinking, and then gently release it.
And Caudron then brings in Milarepa's teaching about the mind having more projections than dust motes dancing in a sunbeam,
Yeah.
suggesting that we might as well give up the struggle against our thoughts and cultivate a sense of humor about it all.
The mind is incredibly creative in its ability to generate endless thoughts and stories.
So the goal isn't to eradicate thoughts altogether, but rather to see their true nature, to recognize that they're more like fleeting dream images than solid fixed realities.
They're just mental events, part of the natural flow of the mind.
And she also touches on the importance of posture in meditation.
Yes, not as a rigid adherence to a specific form, but as a way to support greater relaxation and a sense of groundedness in the body, which can, in turn, help to settle the mind.
Right. And from this foundation of relaxed, non-judgmental awareness, we can then move into this crucial concept of Maitri.
Cultivating loving kindness towards ourselves.
Yes. Caudron emphasizes that genuine spiritual growth and even lasting contentment in our lives requires a deep and honest seeing of ourselves, our patterns, our habits, our tendencies. And Maitri is the process of developing this unconditional sense of friendship and acceptance towards ourselves exactly as we are.
It's not about self-improvement projects or building up some kind of idealized self-image.
Exactly. It's about skillfully and compassionately exposing our own self-deceptions.
Gently dismantling the masks we wear.
Right.
Oh.
And allowing ourselves to be seen, to be known in our fullness.
It all starts with recognizing that everything that arises in our experience, whether it's a thought, an emotion, a memory, it's all part of this continuous flow of experience that's been unfolding since the very beginning.
And it's never too late to start looking at our minds with this kind of open and accepting curiosity.
Never. We can always find a moment to sit down and create that space where anything can arise without judgment.
She makes this really powerful point about how when we habitually engage in disapproval, when we're constantly criticizing ourselves, we're actually practicing disapproval.
We're strengthening that tendency within us.
Exactly. So the more we engage in harshness and self-criticism, the more we reinforce those patterns. And instead, she encourages us to cultivate gentleness, a willingness to let go, to meet whatever arises with a sense of curiosity, rather than making it into a big drama.
Instead of battling our confusion, we can learn to meet it with openness and relaxation.
And she introduces these two Tibetan terms, Sem and Rikpa, to help us understand this process.
Sem is often translated as mind, but in this context, it refers to that more contracted, discursive mind, that constant stream of thoughts that's always trying to reinforce our limited self-image.
Incessant inner chatter.
Right. And Rikpa, on the other hand, means intelligence or brightness. It refers to that unfabricated wisdom mind, that inherent knowing that's always present beneath the surface of all our thinking.
So even while the dogs of our discursive thoughts are barking and running around, we can still learn to touch in with the spaciousness of Rikpa.
Exactly. And she says that with practice, especially the cultivation of Maitri, that inherent spaciousness can start to permeate all aspects of our experience. Our resentments, our fears, our concepts about ourselves and the world, it can all start to feel less solid, less fixed.
More dreamlike, even.
Yes. She tells this wonderful story about a friend of hers who kept having these recurring nightmares about being chased by terrifying monsters. And it wasn't until she made the courageous decision to stop running, to actually turn around and face those monsters, that their power over her began to dissolve.
They turned out to be far less menacing than she had imagined.
Exactly. And she connects this to the Buddhist teaching about the 3 kinds of awakening.
Awakening from sleep, awakening from life at the time of death, and the ultimate awakening into enlightenment from the dream of delusion.
And she suggests that we might as well spend this dream of life looking directly at what scares us rather than constantly trying to escape.
I love that. So instead of running from the ambiguity of loneliness, the invitation is to actually lean into it and see what happens.
Yes, and she also talks about the importance of fully experiencing our sensory experience without judgment or the need to change anything.
To feel the heat when it's hot, the cold when it's cold, the wetness of the rain, the sound of the wind.
It's about letting go of our expectations for constant comfort and recognizing that these ebbs and flows are the very nature of things.
And she draws this really interesting connection between societal issues like environmental pollution and pervasive self-doubt.
She sees them both as symptoms of what she calls a dark age.
And she suggests that practicing Maitri, cultivating loving kindness towards ourselves, is a powerful way to start to illuminate that darkness.
Because when we're so preoccupied with maintaining a certain self-image, We become blind and deaf to the richness and beauty of life that's all around us.
It's like trying to appreciate a field of wildflowers with a hood pulled tightly over your head, or listening to the songs of birds with earplugs in.
Exactly. So, in a world that often feels filled with so much resentment and resistance, cultivating loving kindness towards ourselves seems like a really essential starting point for creating positive change.
Absolutely. Now let's move into this fundamental principle of not causing harm.
Okay.
She starts by talking about this seemingly simple but deeply transformative act of pausing.
To stopping, even for a moment, instead of immediately filling up every bit of space with activity or thought.
And in that pause, we can start to get a sense of both the restlessness that often drives our busyness and the spaciousness that underlies all of our experience.
And she emphasizes that this concept of not causing harm extends far beyond just our physical actions in the world.
Right. It's not just about avoiding actions like killing, stealing, and lying. It also includes refraining from aggression in our speech and even in our thoughts.
And this applies to how we treat ourselves as well as how we treat others.
She sees this principle of non-aggression as a fundamental Buddhist teaching with the potential to create profound healing, both individually and collectively.
Absolutely.
And she suggests that the foundation of an enlightened society is this very personal commitment to not causing harm to ourselves or others in the beginning, the middle, and the end of all our endeavors.
And she talks about the importance of becoming sane citizens.
Right. It all starts with cultivating inner peace, with taking responsibility for our own actions, speech, and thoughts.
And perhaps the most fundamental harm we can inflict upon ourselves is to remain in a state of ignorance, to lack the courage and self-respect to look honestly at ourselves.
So the very ground of not causing harm is mindfulness.
That clear and discerning awareness of our experience, coupled with deep respect and compassion for whatever we observe.
And this mindfulness needs to extend far beyond our formal meditation practice and permeate all aspects of our daily lives.
Exactly. It's about seeing, hearing, feeling, smelling, tasting, without shutting down, without resistance. And it's about respecting ourselves enough to not constantly judge our experience.
It's about approaching everything with a sense of curiosity and openness.
Yes, and as we commit to this path of honesty with ourselves, it can be quite a shock to realize how often we've been unknowingly causing harm.
Through those ingrained patterns of thought and behavior that we weren't even aware of.
And without mindfulness, we remain blind to those patterns.
So mindfulness helps us to see our desires, our aggressions, our moments of ignorance without judgment, without immediately trying to change them.
Just to see them clearly as they arise.
And beneath all this surface-level activity, all the busyness of our lives, she talks about this fundamental sense of groundlessness that underlies everything.
Right. We often experience this as restlessness, anxiety, a feeling of not being fully present.
And it's this groundlessness that often fuels our negative emotions.
And yet we rarely take the time to really explore it.
And so she introduces the practice of refraining.
Refraining.
Yes, it's a deliberate way of learning to settle into that groundlessness, to become more comfortable with the lack of a solid foundation.
So instead of constantly seeking distractions, we actually practice pausing, creating space.
Exactly. And she tells this really powerful story about a young warrior confronting fear.
Fear is often seen as this powerful enemy, something to be avoided at all costs.
Right. But in this story, the warrior approaches fear with a sense of respect, even asking for permission to engage in battle.
And what happens?
Fear, in its own voice, confesses that its primary weapons are fast-talking and getting too close.
It tries to overwhelm us, to make us react impulsively.
Exactly. And so the key to disarming fear is to not act on its dictates, to simply observe it without giving in to its demands.
Interesting. And she also applies this understanding to the concept of well-being of speech.
Right. She uses this beautiful image of a lute without strings.
A lute without strings.
Yeah. It's an instrument that can no longer produce music in the conventional sense, but it still has a presence. It still makes itself known. And she relates this to speech that's settled and grounded, not driven by anxiety or a need to control, but straightforward, disciplined, and authentic.
So it's about speaking from a place of calmness and clarity, not from a place of nervousness or neediness.
Precisely. And she then draws a distinction between the practice of mindfulness and this deeper concept of Yi Tang Che.
Mindfulness is about being present with our experience, without judgment.
Right. But Yi Tang Ke embodies this essential spirit of renunciation that's so central to the spiritual path.
It's the understanding that the pursuit of lasting security in this impermanent world is ultimately futile.
And it requires a willingness to let go of some of our most cherished beliefs, like the belief in a solid, independent self, or the hope of permanently escaping pain.
It's about letting go of that constant striving for something that doesn't exist.
And she even suggests that theism, for some people, can become a form of addiction to hope,
The hope that doubt and mystery will magically disappear.
and that we'll finally find that absolute certainty that we crave.
But she argues that a society built on this kind of addiction to certainty is often less compassionate, less tolerant of ambiguity and difference.
And the first noble truth of Buddhism, she reminds us, is that suffering is an inherent part of the human experience.
It's not necessarily a sign that something's wrong with us.
Right, it's just part of life.
And embracing this truth can bring a tremendous sense of relief.
Because it frees us from the constant struggle to make everything perfect, to make everything okay.
And so, renunciation, in this context, isn't about denying our experience or engaging in harsh self-denial. It's about letting go of the hope that our experience or ourselves could be fundamentally different in this moment.
She tells this really funny and insightful story about a piece of shit.
A piece of shit?
Yeah, it's about our almost instantaneous reaction to reach for something, anything, to avoid discomfort, to avoid those unpleasant feelings. And she calls this hope.
Hope. But isn't hope a good thing?
Well, in this context, she's talking about the kind of hope that keeps us stuck in that cycle of grasping and aversion, that keeps us from simply being present with what is. And she contrasts this with what she calls hopelessness.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
She's not talking about despair or nihilism. She's talking about the kind of hopelessness that comes from recognizing the futility of our attempts to control everything, to make everything perfect. And paradoxically, this acceptance of groundlessness can actually lead to genuine confidence.
I see. So it's about surrendering to what is,
Right.
without trying to change it.
Exactly. And ultimately, she suggests that taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha is about giving up that persistent hope of finding solid ground.
It's about taking refuge in the truth of impermanence, in the reality of suffering, and in the interconnectedness of all things.
And she connects all of our underlying anxiety and dissatisfaction to the fear of death.
Even if we don't consciously think about it, that fear is often lurking in the background, influencing our choices and our reactions.
Right. It's like Shunryu Suzuki Roshi said, life is like getting into a boat that's about to sink.
And Trinko Rinpoche, in his lecture, Death in Everyday Life, really expands on this understanding.
He points out that we experience death in many forms throughout our lives.
Not just physical death, but also the death of our plans, our expectations, our relationships.
The ending of a day, the passing of a second, even the completion of an out-breath.
All these subtle but very real forms of death.
And she includes in this the experience of anything we don't want, anything that makes us uncomfortable.
So from this perspective, death is a constant presence in our lives.
And she argues that this awareness of impermanence, this constant encounter with various forms of death, can actually provide the motivation for living a more insightful and compassionate life.
It can wake us up to the preciousness of this moment, of this life.
And she points out that our individual interpretation of events is often what causes so much of our suffering.
The stories we tell ourselves, the meanings we assign to things.
Right. We each carry around this incredibly subjective inner world, constantly generating emotional reactions based on our own unique interpretations.
Someone says something seemingly innocuous, and we can launch into a whole internal drama.
But that carefully protected self-concept that we invest so much energy in defending is actually quite fragile.
It's like trying to grasp a handful of water.
Exactly. So instead of constantly trying to eradicate uncomfortable feelings like pleasure and pain, maybe the key is to cultivate a deeper understanding of them, to really get to know them,
To see how they arise, how they hook us, how they color our perceptions.
and ultimately to recognize their impermanent, insubstantial nature.
So they become less something to be feared or avoided, and more like interesting visitors that come and go.
And she shares this fascinating story about Padmasambhava.
Padmasambhava, the great tantric master.
Yes. Even he, who was said to be born enlightened, still had to navigate the complexities of the human experience.
What happened?
Well, early in his life, he accidentally killed 2 people.
Oh, wow.
And this experience led him to a profound understanding of the futility of clinging to hope and fear.
I see. So it's not about avoiding difficult experiences, but rather about learning to meet them with wisdom and compassion.
And she encourages us to use our own lives in this way, to use our experiences, both pleasant and unpleasant, to explore those fundamental pairs of opposites, to turn our problems into sources of wisdom and insight.
Turning poison into medicine.
Exactly. And she uses this beautiful analogy of children building a sandcastle.
The sandcastle represents our attachments, the things we cling to.
Right. We put so much care and attention into creating this beautiful structure, but we know deep down that the tide will eventually come in and wash it away.
And the key is to enjoy the process of creation without clinging to its permanence.
To let go when the time comes without resentment or despair.
It's about cultivating a kind of non-attachment that's infused with kindness and understanding.
And a deep desire to really know ourselves, to understand the nature of our own pain and pleasure, so that we can eventually release that endless cycle of running towards what feels good and grasping to avoid what feels bad.
And she emphasizes that this kind of insight into our own hooks and tendencies ultimately leads to a greater sense of compassion for all of humanity.
Because when we really start to understand our own struggles, it naturally makes us more willing to extend understanding and support to others who are navigating their own challenges.
It all starts with that courageous inward look, with honestly examining our own hopes and fears, and learning to simply be present with that raw energy without getting caught in the stories our minds create.
Okay, so let's move on to this concept of 6 kinds of loneliness.
Loneliness, right. Something we typically try to avoid at all costs.
Exactly. But Chodron suggests that we might try approaching loneliness from a different angle, that we might actually try to make friends with it.
Make friends with loneliness. How do we do that?
She distinguishes between what she calls hot loneliness and cool loneliness.
Okay.
Hot loneliness is characterized by that restless energy, that feeling of wanting to escape, to distract ourselves. It's the kind of loneliness that makes us reach for the phone, scroll through social media, or engage in any kind of activity to avoid feeling that discomfort.
And cool loneliness.
Cool loneliness is about learning to simply rest in the middle of that feeling, without judgment, without the need to fix it or change it.
So it's about embracing the discomfort instead of running from it.